The blizzard hit in late November with the fury that only Montana winters could deliver. Sarah woke to a world transformed, where the familiar landmarks of the ranch had disappeared under 3 feet of snow and wind howled around the cabin with a voice that seemed almost alive. Through the frosted window, she could see nothing but white, swirling chaos that made the barn appear to float like a ghost ship in an ocean of snow. "Mom, I can't see the horses," Tommy said, pressing his face against the glass with worry written across his young features. "They're safe in the barn," Sarah assured him, though she felt her own anxiety rising. This was their first serious storm at the ranch, and she wasn't sure what protocol she should follow. In the 5 months since they had arrived, she had grown confident in her daily routines, but this weather was beyond anything she had experienced. The lights flickered twice, then went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the cabin in an eerie glow that made the storm outside seem even more threatening. Amy looked up from her book with the alert expression she wore whenever their security felt threatened. "What do we do?" Amy asked, her voice steady but watchful. Before Sarah could answer, they heard the distinct sound of someone knocking on their door. Through the storm, Jake's voice called out, "Sarah? It's Jake. Can I come in?" Sarah opened the door to find Jake covered in snow, his face red from cold and wind. Behind him, she could see the faint outline of a rope stretching from their cabin toward the main buildings. "Power's out across the whole ranch," Jake said, stepping inside and shaking snow from his coat. "Generators running for the barn and main house, but these cabins are on a different circuit. I wanted to make sure you folks were okay and had what you needed." "We're fine," Sarah said automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, I'm not sure what we should be doing. I've never been through a storm like this." Jake nodded, understanding her uncertainty. "First rule of ranch blizzards: nobody goes anywhere alone. That rope outside connects us to the main buildings. As long as we follow it, we can't get lost, even if visibility drops to 0. He looked around their small cabin, assessing their preparedness with the practical eye of someone who had weathered dozens of such storms. "You've got enough firewood for tonight, and I saw you stocked up on non-perishables last week. The important thing is to stay warm and stay connected with the rest of the ranch." Tommy tugged on Jake's sleeve. "Are the horses scared?" "Horses are smart about storms," Jake replied, crouching to Tommy's level. "They know to stay close together and keep warm. Thunder's probably telling the other horses stories right now, keeping everyone calm." Amy giggled at the idea of horses telling stories, and some of the tension left the room. Jake had a gift for making even difficult situations feel manageable through his steady presence and gentle humor. "How long do these storms usually last?" Sarah asked. "Could be a day, could be 3. Weather Service says this one's moving fast, but in Montana, the Weather Service is more like a suggestion than a promise." Jake paused, seeming to consider something. "I was thinking, if you folks don't mind, I could stay here tonight. Keep the fire going, help with anything that comes up. Main house is crowded with all the hands staying in, and, frankly, I'd rather be somewhere I feel useful." Sarah felt relief flood through her, though she tried not to show how much his offer meant to her. "We'd like that. Wouldn't we, kids?" Amy and Tommy nodded enthusiastically. Over the months, Jake had become not just a friend but a source of security, someone whose presence made any situation feel more manageable. As the day wore on, the storm intensified. Wind shook the cabin with gusts that sounded like freight trains, and snow piled against the windows until the world outside disappeared entirely. But inside their small space, an unexpected coziness developed. Jake kept the fire burning steady and bright. Sarah made hot chocolate on their gas camping stove. Amy read aloud from one of her adventure books, while Tommy played with toy horses Jake had carved for him during evening hours throughout the fall. "Tell us about the worst storm you ever saw," Amy requested during a lull in the wind. Jake settled back in his chair, considering. "That would be the storm of '98. I was working a ranch up near the Canadian border, and we got hit with 4 days of blizzard conditions. Couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Lost power, lost phone service, lost contact with the outside world completely." "What did you do?" Tommy asked, wide-eyed. "Well, the first thing you learn about serious storms is that panic doesn't help anyone. So we organized ourselves, made sure everyone was accounted for, rationed food, and fuel, took turns keeping watch through the night. The hardest part wasn't the cold or the inconvenience. It was staying calm when you couldn't know how bad things were getting. Were you scared? Amy asked. Jake considered the question seriously. I was concerned. When you can't control a situation, fear is natural. But I've learned that fear becomes dangerous when it stops you from doing what needs to be done. The trick is to acknowledge the fear and then focus on the next right thing. As if to test Jake's philosophy, the wind suddenly died to an eerie stillness that felt more ominous than the previous chaos. Jake moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. Eye of the storm, he said quietly. We're about to get the second half. Within minutes, the wind returned with doubled fury. The cabin shook hard enough to rattle dishes in the cupboard, and they could hear objects blowing around outside that would normally be secured. Sarah moved closer to the children, her protective instincts heightened by the raw power of the storm. Then, they heard a sound that made Jake move quickly toward his coat. The panicked neighing of horses carrying across the wind from the direction of the barn. Something's wrong, Jake said, already pulling on his boots. Horses don't sound like that unless there's real trouble. You can't go out in this, Sarah said, grabbing his arm. You said yourself nobody should go anywhere alone. The horses might be in danger. If something's happened to the barn, if a tree fell or the roof is failing. Jake looked torn between his concern for the animals and his responsibility to the human family in front of him. Amy stood up with the determined expression she wore when making important decisions. Then we all go. Mom, you said we're all part of this ranch now. If the horses are in trouble, we help. Sarah's first instinct was to keep her children safe in the cabin, but she realized that Amy was right. They had become part of this community, and with that belonging came responsibility. More than that, she knew that Jake would go regardless of the danger, and she couldn't let him face whatever was wrong alone. What do we need to do? Sarah asked. Jake looked at her for a long moment, recognizing the courage in her decision. Bundle up warm. We follow the guide rope, stay connected to each other, move as a unit. If I say stop or come back, we do it immediately without discussion. They dressed in layers, wrapped scarves around their faces, and connected themselves with a length of rope Jake carried for emergencies. Tommy went between Amy and Sarah, while Jake led the way, following the guide rope that was their lifeline through the whiteout conditions. The journey to the barn felt like traveling through an alien landscape. The familiar ranch had become a maze of snow drifts and howling wind where direction meant nothing, and every step required faith in the rope connecting them to safety. Sarah kept one hand on Tommy's shoulder and the other on the guide rope, trusting Jake's steady progress through conditions that would have terrified her just months earlier. When they reached the barn, they found the source of the horses' distress. A large pine tree had fallen across the roof, not breaking through but creating enough pressure to warp the structure and leave a gap where wind and snow were pouring in. The horses, already nervous from the storm, had become increasingly agitated as their shelter was compromised. We need to get them calm and warm, Jake shouted over the wind. Sarah, can you and Amy work on getting extra blankets on them? Tommy, help me clear this snow and see what we can do about that gap. Working together in the dim light of emergency lanterns, they transformed crisis into coordinated action. Sarah discovered a confidence she hadn't known she possessed as she worked to soothe the frightened animals. Amy showed remarkable intuition in reading which horses needed the most attention. Tommy proved invaluable at squeezing into small spaces to retrieve scattered equipment. Jake worked steadily to patch the gap in the roof with available materials, creating a temporary barrier that would hold until the storm passed and proper repairs could be made. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to restore the horses' sense of security. Thunder, who had been the most agitated of all the animals, settled noticeably when Tommy approached his stall. The boy whispered quietly to the big horse, and Sarah watched in amazement as the animal's ears shifted forward, listening to her son with obvious trust and affection. He's telling Thunder that the storm will pass, Amy said, having moved close enough to hear her brother's words. He's promising that we won't leave them alone. After 2 hours of work, they had done everything possible to secure the barn and comfort the animals. The horses had settled into the resigned patience that experienced animals showed during difficult weather, and the immediate crisis had passed. As they made their way back to the cabin, fighting against wind that seemed determined to push them off course, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed in her understanding of what it meant to belong somewhere. She and her children had just risked their safety to protect animals that belonged to someone else, on property they didn't own, during a storm that tested everyone's limits. But it hadn't felt like risk or duty. It had felt like family taking care of family. Back in the warmth of the cabin, as they dried off and changed into warm clothes, Tommy made an observation that captured what they had all been feeling. "The horses knew we would come," he said simply. "That's why they called for help. They knew we wouldn't leave them alone." Jake looked at Sarah over Tommy's head, and she saw in his expression the same recognition she felt. They had crossed some invisible line tonight, moving from helpers and friends to something deeper and more permanent. The storm continued for 2 more days, but the crisis at the barn had established them as a unit that faced challenges together. They developed routines for checking on the animals, maintaining the fire, and keeping everyone fed and entertained. Amy organized word games and storytelling sessions. Tommy helped Jake with small repair projects around the cabin. Sarah found herself cooking for Jake as naturally as she cooked for her children, their domestic routine expanding to include him without discussion or awkwardness. On the second evening, as they sat around the fire sharing the last of Sarah's homemade cookies, Amy asked the question that had been building in all their minds. "Jake, do you think you might want to stay here permanently? I mean, not just during storms, but always." The directness of the question caught both adults off guard, though neither was truly surprised. Amy had always been the one to voice what others were thinking, but weren't ready to say. Jake looked at Sarah, checking her reaction before responding to Amy's question. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate, realizing that her daughter had asked the question she herself had been afraid to voice. "That would depend on a lot of things," Jake said carefully. "On whether your mom thought that was a good idea. On whether you kids really wanted that. On what it would mean for all of us as a family. We're already a family," Tommy said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "We take care of each other and worry about each other and work together. That's what families do." Sarah felt tears she didn't try to hide. "Is that what we are? A family?" "I think," Jake said slowly, "that families aren't always about blood or legal documents. Sometimes they're about choice. About people who decide to face life together, who choose to care about each other's happiness and well-being." Amy nodded seriously. "So we choose each other. If that's what everyone wants," Sarah said, her voice carrying both hope and caution. "If everyone's sure that's what they want." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had imagined possible when she first arrived at the ranch with 2 traumatized children and a suitcase full of fears. They talked about practical matters, where Jake would live, how they would handle finances, what their relationship would look like to the outside world. But they also talked about dreams and hopes, about the kind of family they wanted to build and the values they wanted to share. By the time they went to sleep on that last night of the storm, they had reached an understanding that felt both surprising and inevitable. Jake would move his belongings into the cabin. They would approach Mr. Henderson about expanding Sarah's role to include more ranch management responsibilities. Amy would continue planning her future as a rancher, and Tommy would officially become Thunder's primary caretaker. Most importantly, they would face whatever came next as a family unit, bound not by tragedy or convenience, but by the conscious choice to build something good together. When the storm finally passed and the sun emerged to reveal a world transformed by snow and ice, the ranch hands worked together to clear paths and assess damage. The tree that had fallen on the barn became a community project, with everyone contributing to repairs that would make the structure stronger than before. Sarah stood in the bright, cold morning air, watching Jake work alongside her children to restore the horse shelter, and realized that the metaphor was perfect. The storm had tested them, damaged some things that needed repair, but ultimately revealed the solid foundation beneath all the surface disruption. Mr. Henderson, when they approached him about their new arrangements, proved to be more understanding than Sarah had expected. The ranch had always functioned as an extended family, he explained, and official families were especially welcome. Jake's experience and Sarah's management skills, combined with the children's obvious love for ranch life, made them exactly the kind of permanent staff he had hoped to find. 6 months later, as spring returned to the Montana mountains and the ranch came alive with new calves and fresh grass, Sarah often thought about that November storm. It had been the moment when their small family stopped being a temporary arrangement and became a permanent choice. Amy was already making plans for her agricultural education, corresponding with universities that offered ranch management programs. Tommy had become the unofficial horse whisperer for the entire ranch, with other hands seeking his help with difficult animals. Jake had settled into his role as both ranch foreman and family patriarch with the contentment of a man who had finally found where he belonged. And Sarah had discovered that it was possible to honor the love she had shared with David while also embracing the different, but equally profound love she had found with Jake. The two relationships didn't compete or diminish each other. Instead, they had taught her that the heart's capacity for love was larger and more resilient than she had ever imagined. On a warm evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching Amy teach Tommy to ride bareback and listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into night, Jake reached for Sarah's hand. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question, thinking of all the fears she had overcome, all the risks they had taken, all the ways their lives had changed since that first morning when a quiet cowboy had fixed their screen door without being asked. "None," she said, squeezing his hand. "Not a single one." In the distance, thunder nickered softly to the other horses, a sound of contentment that carried across the evening air. Tommy looked up from his riding lesson and waved at them, his face bright with joy and confidence. Amy called out, "Look, I can steer with just my knees." And Jake smiled, watching the children he had helped heal, now teaching each other new ways to be brave. The ranch stretched out around them under the vast Montana sky, no longer just a place of employment or refuge, but home in the deepest sense of the word. A place where people chose to care for each other, where storms were weathered together, where quiet acts of kindness grew into something larger and more lasting than any of them had dared to hope. Sarah had been wrong months earlier when she thought the silence of their new life would be filled with loneliness. Instead, it had been filled with love, steady, growing, chosen love that proved every day that the most important thing anyone could say to someone facing difficulty was the simple truth: "You're not alone anymore." The October morning brought the first real frost to the Broken Arrow Ranch, turning the grass silver and sending steam rising from the water troughs. Jake found Sarah standing in the kitchen doorway, looking out at the changed landscape with an expression he couldn't quite read. 2 months had passed since that first dinner together, and the Chin family had slowly begun to feel like a permanent part of the ranch's rhythm. "Winter comes early in Montana," Jake said, joining her on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Sarah accepted the mug gratefully. "Tommy's never seen real snow. Amy remembers a little from when we lived in Colorado, but that was years ago." She paused, watching her children walk to the school bus stop with the easy confidence they had developed over their months at the ranch. "I keep wondering if I made the right choice, bringing them here." Jake studied her face. "What makes you doubt it now?" "The school counselor called yesterday. She says both kids are doing well academically, but Tommy's teacher is concerned that he's too attached to the ranch. She thinks he might have trouble adjusting if we ever move on." Sarah's voice carried the weight of uncertainty that Jake had learned to recognize. "And Amy asked me last night if we're going to leave when winter ends, like seasonal workers do." "What did you tell her?" "I didn't know what to say. This was supposed to be temporary, just until I got back on my feet. But now," she gestured toward the horizon where the mountains caught the morning light, "Tommy's been helping with the horses like a natural, and Amy's got a head for ranch management that impresses everyone." The conversation was interrupted by Amy running back from the bus stop, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Mom, the bus has a flat tire. Mrs. Jackson says they're sending another one, but it might be an hour late." Sarah immediately shifted into problem-solving mode. "I'll drive you to school. Let me get my keys," and car's still making that grinding noise, Jake interrupted gently. Sarah's vehicle had developed new mechanical problems that she couldn't afford to fix, leaving her essentially stranded except for essential trips to town. Amy looked between the adults, reading the tension she had learned to recognize when money problems surfaced. "It's okay, Mom. I can miss one day. I'll help with the horses, or no," Jake said firmly. "Education's too important to miss." He pulled his truck keys from his pocket and handed them to Sarah. "Take my truck. I'll stay here and work on that fence repair with Amy and Tommy until the evening bus comes through." Sarah hesitated, as she always did when offered help that felt too generous. But Amy's hopeful expression and the practical necessity of getting to school won out. "Are you sure? I know you had plans to work the south pasture today. Fence work's been waiting 3 weeks. One more day won't hurt." Jake was already walking toward the barn. "Amy, want to learn how to mend wire properly? It's a skill every ranch hand needs." As Sarah drove Amy to school in Jake's truck, she found herself thinking about permanence for the first time in months. The ranch had become more than just a place to work and live. It had become a community where her children were known and cared for by everyone from the ranch hands to the elderly man who delivered feed twice a week. When she returned from town, she found Jake and Tommy working together to repair a section of pasture fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree. Tommy was concentrating intensely on the task Jake had given him, his small hands steady as he held wire in place while Jake secured it with pliers. "You're getting good at this," Jake was saying. "Pretty soon you'll be teaching me new tricks." Tommy beamed with pride. "Thunder let me brush his mane this morning. He doesn't usually like anyone touching his mane. That's because horses can tell when someone respects them. Thunder knows you're not trying to boss him around. Just be his partner." Sarah watched from a distance, recognizing something profound in the interaction. Jake never talked down to the children or simplified his explanations. Instead, he treated them like capable people who deserved real responsibility and honest conversation. It was exactly what they needed after months of adults tiptoeing around their grief. That afternoon, while Tommy napped and Amy worked on homework at the kitchen table, Sarah found Jake repairing a broken gate latch near the main barn. She had been thinking about their morning conversation all day and, finally, worked up the courage to address what was really bothering her. "Jake, can I ask you something personal?" He looked up from his work, nodding for her to continue. "Why are you doing all this for us? I mean, really. Not the polite answer about being neighborly, but the real reason." Jake set down his tools and leaned against the fence post, considering his words carefully. "I told you about my daughter, Rebecca. What I didn't tell you was how angry she was after Martha died. Angry at God, angry at me, angry at the whole world for taking her mother away. She stopped talking to me for months, just went through the motions of living." He paused, looking toward the mountains. "I thought if I just gave her space, she'd work through it on her own. Thought that was what strong people did. But space wasn't what she needed. She needed to see that life could still include joy, still include connection. She needed someone to show her that caring about people again wouldn't mean more loss." "What happened to her?" Sarah asked softly. "She's a veterinarian now, lives in Denver. Married to a good man, has 2 kids of her own. But it took years to rebuild our relationship. Years I can't get back because I was too proud to ask for help and too scared to let anyone else care about us." Jake met Sarah's eyes directly. "When I see Tommy learning to trust again, see Amy starting to laugh, see you allowing yourself to hope for something better than just survival, I'm not just helping your family. I'm fixing something that's been broken in me for a long time." Sarah felt tears she had been holding back for months finally surface. "I'm so tired of being afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of caring too much about this place. Afraid of letting the kids get too attached. Afraid that if I admit how much I need the kindness you've shown us, something will happen to take it away." "Fear's a reasonable response to loss," Jake said gently. "But it's not a way to live. Your husband wouldn't want you, and the kids stuck in that fear forever." That evening, Sarah made a decision that had been building for weeks. After dinner, she called Mr. Henderson and asked if they could discuss the possibility of staying at the ranch permanently. The conversation was brief, but positive. Henderson had been hoping she would want to stay, and they agreed to meet the following week to work out details about salary, housing, and her role in ranch operations. When she told Amy and Tommy about the conversation, their reactions confirmed what she had already known in her heart. Amy whooped with joy and immediately began making plans for decorating their cabin for Halloween. Tommy's response was quieter, but equally meaningful. He asked if this meant Thunder would be his horse now, not just the horse he helped care for. The next few days brought an energy to the Chun household that had been missing since before David's deployment. Amy threw herself into planning a Halloween party for the ranch hands, convinced that the rough cowboys needed someone to organize proper festivities. Tommy spent every free moment with the horses, his confidence growing daily as he took on more responsibility for their care. But it was Jake who noticed the change in Sarah that was perhaps most significant. She had stopped looking over her shoulder, stopped bracing for the next crisis. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she was making plans that stretched beyond the immediate needs of each day. The change became clear during a particularly busy Saturday when 3 ranch hands called in sick, and the work of moving cattle to winter pasture fell to whoever was available. Without hesitation, Sarah packed lunches for the remaining crew and announced that she and Amy would help with the roundup, while Tommy stayed with Jake to manage the horses and equipment. Sarah proved to be a capable rider, and Amy showed natural instincts for reading cattle behavior that impressed the experienced hands. Working together under the wide Montana sky, the ranch felt less like Sarah's workplace and more like her home ground. That evening, as they all sat around the kitchen table sharing stories from the day's work, Amy made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I've been thinking about what I want to be when I grow up," she said seriously. "I want to be a rancher. Not just someone who works on a ranch, but someone who owns one and makes the decisions about how to take care of the animals and the land." "That's a big dream," Jake said. "What made you think of it?" "I like how everything here has a purpose. The horses have jobs, the cattle have their place, the land has what it needs to stay healthy. And I like how everyone works together to take care of everything. It feels like being part of something important." Sarah felt her chest tighten with emotion. This was the first time in almost 2 years that Amy had talked about the future with excitement instead of anxiety. Her daughter was making plans based on hope instead of just trying to get through each day. After the children went to bed, Sarah and Jake sat on the cabin porch, watching the stars appear in the clear mountain air. The conversation between them had evolved over the months from polite exchanges to something deeper, built on shared experience and mutual respect. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Sarah admitted. "Things are going so well now that I'm afraid something has to go wrong." "Bad things happen whether we worry about them or not," Jake said. "But good things happen too, and they're worth risking the worry." "Is that what you tell yourself when you care about someone? That they're worth the risk?" Jake looked at her carefully. "Are we talking about the kids or something else?" Sarah felt her cheeks warm, grateful for the darkness that hid her blush. "I don't know. Maybe both. This whole situation is more complicated than I expected when I took the job." "Complicated how?" She struggled to find words for feelings she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge until recently. "When I married David, I thought I understood what it meant to build a life with someone. We had plans, shared dreams, a future we were working toward together. When he died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I'd spend the rest of my years just taking care of Amy and Tommy and trying to honor his memory. But these months here, watching you with my children, seeing the way you care about our well-being without expecting anything in return, feeling like we're part of something bigger than just surviving." She paused, searching for the right words. "I guess I'm discovering that there might be room in my life for more than just grief and responsibility." Jake was quiet for a long moment, understanding the courage it had taken for her to voice those thoughts. "What does that mean for you? For us? I don't know yet. I just know that for the first time since David died, I can imagine a future that includes more than just getting by. I can imagine actually living again, instead of just existing." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Tommy calling for Sarah from inside the cabin. He had been having nightmares less frequently lately, but they still occurred occasionally, usually triggered by storms or changes in routine. Sarah started to get up, but Jake touched her arm gently. "Let me try something." He went into the cabin and sat on the edge of Tommy's bed. Sarah listened from the doorway as Jake's quiet voice filled the room. "Hey, partner. Bad dream?" Tommy nodded, still half asleep, but clearly distressed. "Want to tell me about it?" "The horses were gone," Tommy whispered. "Thunder was gone. and I couldn't find him anywhere. Well, I just checked on all the horses before we came inside. Thunder's in his stall, probably dreaming about tomorrow's oats. Want to know a secret about horses? Tommy nodded. They never forget their friends. Once a horse decides you're his person, he'll always remember you. Thunder's not going anywhere without you. Within minutes, Tommy had settled back into peaceful sleep, comforted by the certainty in Jake's voice, and the security of knowing his place in this new world was stable. As Jake rejoined Sarah on the porch, she realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of their relationship. This wasn't just about Jake helping her family through a difficult time. It had become about building something new together, something that honored the past while embracing the possibility of a different kind of future. "Thank you," she said. And this time the words carried implications that went far beyond gratitude for help with her son. "Thank you for trusting me with all of this," Jake replied. "For letting me be part of their lives, part of yours." As they sat in comfortable silence under the vast Montana sky, both understood that they were no longer just neighbors or friends helping each other through difficult times. They had become something more complicated and more precious, a chosen family, built not from obligation or circumstance, but from the conscious decision to care for each other across the distances of loss and the promise of hope. The ranch settled into its nighttime quiet around them, but the silence no longer felt empty or lonely. It felt full of possibility, warm with connection, rich with the understanding that some of life's most important conversations happened without words, in the space between acknowledgement and action, in the decision to stay present for whatever came next. The morning sun painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and orange as Jake Morrison adjusted his worn leather gloves and checked the fence line one more time. At 62, his weathered hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 4 decades working cattle ranches across the western states. The Broken Arrow Ranch stretched out before him like a sea of green grass dotted with black Angus cattle. But Jake's mind wasn't on the livestock today. 3 weeks ago, everything had changed when Sarah Chun arrived at the ranch with her 2 children, Amy and Tommy. Sarah's husband had died in Afghanistan 8 months earlier, leaving her with medical bills that swallowed her teacher's salary and 2 kids who barely spoke above a whisper. The bank had foreclosed on their small house in Billings, and Sarah's only option was the job opening for a ranch cook that paid room and board. Jake had watched from a distance as the family settled into the small cabin behind the main house. He noticed how Sarah worked from dawn until well past dark, preparing meals for the ranch hands and trying to make their tiny new home feel welcoming. He saw how 8-year-old Amy helped her mother without being asked, her small face serious beyond her years. And he observed how 6-year-old Tommy hadn't spoken a word since arriving, communicating only through nods and the occasional tug on his sister's sleeve. The other ranch hands were good men, but they gave the family space, unsure how to interact with the quiet woman and her children. Jake understood their hesitation. Sarah carried herself with a dignified reserve that made it clear she didn't want pity, and the children seemed fragile, like wild animals that might bolt at any sudden movement. But Jake recognized something in their situation that the younger men couldn't see. He had been where they were now, though his circumstances had been different. 35 years ago, after his wife Martha died in a car accident, he had found himself alone with his teenage daughter, Rebecca. The grief had been overwhelming, and the silence in their house had felt like a living thing that threatened to consume them both. Back then, it was an older ranch foreman named Bill Santos who had quietly stepped in to help. Bill never made a big show of it, never drew attention to Jake's struggles. Instead, he would appear at just the right moments with exactly what was needed. A casserole when Jake forgot to buy groceries. An invitation for Rebecca to help with the horses when she seemed lost in her sadness. A steady presence that said without words that they weren't facing their grief alone. Bill had died 5 years ago, but his lessons lived on in Jake's approach to life. He believed in quiet kindness, in showing up without fanfare, in being the kind of neighbor that people could count on without having to ask for help. So Jake began his own quiet campaign to support the Chin family, though he was careful to do it in ways that wouldn't embarrass Sarah or make her feel like charity. He started by fixing the broken screen door on their cabin while they were at lunch, leaving no note or explanation. When he noticed that Tommy seemed fascinated by the horses but was too shy to approach them, Jake began doing his evening horse care near the cabin, moving slowly and talking in the low, gentle voice he used with skittish colts. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening when Jake was brushing down Thunder, his favorite quarter horse. Tommy had been watching from the cabin porch for 20 minutes when Jake made his move. Without looking directly at the boy, he said, "This old horse is feeling pretty lonely tonight. I bet he'd like some company while I brush him down." Tommy looked around for his mother or sister, found neither, and, after a long moment of internal debate, walked slowly toward the corral. Jake continued his work, giving the boy space to approach at his own pace. When Tommy reached the fence, Jake handed him a soft brush without ceremony. "Thunder's got a sweet spot right behind his ears," Jake said, demonstrating with his own brush. "He's been with me for 12 years now. Found him as a wild Mustang with a bad leg injury. Took months before he'd let me touch him, but once he trusted me, we became partners." Tommy took the brush with careful hands and began copying Jake's motions. Thunder, sensing the boy's nervousness, stood perfectly still, occasionally turning his great head to look at his new groomer with what seemed like approval. They worked in comfortable silence for 20 minutes before Sarah appeared, clearly having been searching for her son. She started to call Tommy away, but Jake caught her eye and shook his head slightly. "He's got good hands with horses," Jake said simply. "Thunder doesn't trust just anyone." That became their evening routine. Tommy would appear at the corral around 6 o'clock, and Jake would find gentle tasks for him to help with. They talked little at first, but gradually Tommy began asking questions about the horses, about ranch work, about the mountains that surrounded their new home. Amy was harder to reach. At 8, she had appointed herself as her mother's protector and her brother's guardian. She watched Jake's interactions with Tommy with the suspicious eyes of someone who had learned too young that the world could take away the people you loved without warning. Jake's opportunity with Amy came during a thunderstorm that rolled through the valley on a Thursday night. The storm brought hail and high winds that spooked the cattle and sent them scattering across the range. Jake was saddling his horse to help round them up when he saw Amy standing on the cabin porch, watching the chaos with wide eyes. Scared, he called over the wind. Amy shook her head quickly, but Jake saw her flinch when lightning lit up the sky. He made a decision that went against ranch protocol. Instead of riding out immediately, he dismounted and walked over to the porch. "Want to help me with something important?" he asked. Amy nodded, curious despite herself. Jake led her to the barn where they kept the ranch's communication equipment. During storms like this, someone needs to stay by the radio in case the hands need help or there's an emergency. It's one of the most important jobs on the ranch, but it has to be someone calm and smart. "Think you can handle it?" Amy's chest puffed out slightly with pride. "Yes, sir." Jake showed her how to work the radio, how to take messages, and how to read the weather radar on the old computer. Then, he left her there with a thermos of hot chocolate and the responsibility she craved. Throughout the night, as he and the other hands worked to gather the scattered cattle, Amy's voice came through the radio clear and steady, relaying messages and weather updates with the seriousness of a seasoned dispatcher. When Jake returned to the barn at dawn, wet and exhausted, he found Amy still at her post, though she had fallen asleep with her head on the desk beside the radio. He covered her with his jacket and let her sleep until her mother came looking for her an hour later. "She did real good work last night," Jake told Sarah as Amy stirred awake. "Kept us all connected and safe. That takes real responsibility." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jake tipped his hat. "Thank you. We needed someone we could count on, and Amy proved she's that person." From that night on, Amy began to soften around Jake. She started helping him with small tasks around the ranch, always serious and focused, but gradually showing flashes of the curious, intelligent girl beneath her protective shell. Sarah was the most challenging of the three. Her grief was complicated by guilt, worry, and the overwhelming pressure of single parenthood. She worked constantly, as if staying busy could keep her fears at bay. Jake noticed that she rarely sat down during meals, instead hovering nearby, ready to refill coffee or bring more food. She declined invitations to join the ranch hands for their evening conversations, always finding tasks that needed completion. Jake's approach with Sarah required the most patience. He began by making her work easier in small, unobtrusive ways. He would arrive in the kitchen 15 minutes early to help with heavy lifting or to quietly wash dishes while she finished cooking. When he noticed that her old car was making concerning noises, he left a note under her windshield with the name of an honest mechanic in town and an offer to drive her there if needed. But the real connection came through their children. As Tommy began to open up and Amy started smiling again, Sarah couldn't help but notice the change in them. She began to watch Jake more carefully, trying to understand what he was doing that was reaching her children when her own efforts felt inadequate. The moment of truth came 3 weeks after the thunderstorm. Sarah's car had finally broken down completely, leaving her stranded 30 miles from town with no way to get groceries or handle the banking that couldn't wait another week. She had been sitting in the broken-down vehicle for 20 minutes, trying not to cry, when Jake appeared in his pickup truck. He had been driving back from delivering cattle to the auction house when he spotted her car on the side of the road. Without hesitation, he pulled over and got out to assess the situation. The engine was making a sound that clearly indicated expensive repairs, and Sarah's face showed the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. "Looks like she's given up the ghost," Jake said, looking under the hood. "But that's what trucks are for. Let's get you where you need to go." Sarah wanted to refuse. She had been refusing help for months, determined to handle everything on her own. But sitting in that broken car, with a list of errands that couldn't be postponed and children waiting for her at home, she found herself accepting Jake's offer. The drive into town became an unexpected conversation. Sarah found herself telling Jake about her husband, about the months before his deployment when they had talked about buying a small ranch of their own, about the dreams that felt impossible now. Jake listened without offering solutions or empty platitudes, just letting her words fill the space between them. When they reached the bank, Jake waited in the truck without being asked. When they went to the grocery store, he helped carry bags without making it feel like charity. And when they stopped at the mechanic's shop to arrange for her car to be towed, he stood beside her as the mechanic delivered the bad news about repair costs, his quiet presence offering strength. On the drive back to the ranch, Sarah was quiet for a long time before she spoke. "I don't know how to do this," she said suddenly. "Everyone tells me I'm strong, that I'm handling everything so well, but I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm drowning, and I'm terrified that my kids can see it." Jake was quiet for a moment before responding. "When my wife died, I thought strength meant handling everything alone. Thought that asking for help meant I was failing Martha, failing my daughter. Took me a long time to understand that real strength sometimes means letting people care about you. But how do you accept help without feeling like you're taking advantage? How do you trust that people's kindness is real and not just pity? You pay attention to how they treat you," Jake said simply. "Pity makes you feel small. Real caring makes you feel seen. There's a difference." Sarah looked out at the passing landscape, processing his words. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," Jake admitted. "But it's necessary. Your kids are watching how you handle this. They need to see that it's okay to let people help, that accepting kindness doesn't make you weak." When they pulled into the ranch, Amy and Tommy were waiting on the porch, clearly relieved to see their mother return safely. As Jake helped unload groceries, Sarah made a decision that had been building for weeks. "Jake," she called as he headed toward his own cabin. "Would you like to join us for dinner tonight? Actually join us, not just eat and run." Jake stopped and turned back, a small smile crossing his weathered face. "I'd like that very much." That evening, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, the Chun family sat down to a meal with a guest who felt like family. Tommy chattered about his day with the horses, Amy described a book she was reading, and Sarah found herself laughing at Jake's gentle stories about ranch mishaps and stubborn cattle. As the sun set outside their small cabin, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The silence in their home had been filled with warmth instead of grief. Her children's faces showed peace instead of worry. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, she felt like they might actually be home. Jake stayed until the children's bedtime, helping Amy with math homework and listening to Tommy's excited plans for learning to ride horses. When he finally stood to leave, Sarah walked him to the door. "Thank you," she said. And this time the words carried weight beyond politeness. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," Jake replied. "It's been a long time since this old cowboy felt needed." As Jake walked back to his own cabin under the star-filled Montana sky, he thought about Bill Santos and the lessons in quiet kindness that had shaped his own approach to life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for the Chin family, new opportunities to show them that they weren't facing their struggles alone. But tonight, he had taken the first real step toward becoming the kind of neighbor and friend that Sarah and her children needed. The kind of person who showed up without fanfare, who offered support without strings attached, who understood that sometimes the most important work happened in the quiet moments between the big gestures. The ranch settled into evening quiet around them. But, for the first time in months, that silence felt peaceful instead of lonely. In the small cabin, Sarah tucked her children into bed with kisses and stories, while across the yard, Jake sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, planning the small acts of kindness that would gradually show a grieving family that their new home came with a guardian they could trust. The work of healing had begun, one quiet gesture at a time.